The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in modern history. People went from the excitement of parties and jazz music in the Roaring Twenties to losing their life savings and standing in bread lines within just a few years. The Depression wasn't confined to the United States, it spread across the World War II. But what actually started the Great Depression and what can we learn from it? Let's start in 1918. World War I had just ended, and American soldiers were returning home, having won the war. During the war, women had entered the workforce in large numbers for the first time. With men returning, the economy boomed, creating the era known as the Roaring Twenties. In Detroit, Michigan, a man named Henry Ford revolutionized transportation with the introduction of the Ford Model T car. Facing huge demand for the car, Ford's company introduced the moving assembly line. This mass production method reduced the price of the car from $780 in 1910 to $290 by 1924, making it the first affordable car for the masses. By 1927, the 15th millionth Model T rolled off the assembly line. Many companies adopted Ford's assembly line process, mass-producing other products like washing machines and vacuum cleaners. With the mass production of new products and the rise of advertising, especially through the radio, the age of consumerism officially began. Everyone wanted the latest and greatest products, and banks started giving out loans more freely to people, allowing them to buy these new products on credit. Times were good. People were partying, jazz music filled the air, and the spirit of socializing was everywhere. Prohibition had started in 1920, but it had little effect on this generation. Parties were bigger, morals were looser, and Wall Street became the place to be. From 1921 to 1929, the US stock market increased sixfold. The post-war boom, easy credit, and the demand for new consumer products drove this growth. As the public became more aware of the incredible returns from the stock market, everyone started putting money in, talking about it more, and creating a snowball effect. The stock market continued to rise, and people began blindly investing all their savings in stocks, even taking out loans to do so. This pushed prices up further, with people believing that no price was too high for a stock. This is a warning sign that the price is no longer based on fundamentals and may have been artificially inflated. Although stock prices were reaching new heights, something wasn't right. By the mid-1920s, demand for products had begun to slow down. Europe was still recovering from the aftermath of World War I, and few countries could afford new consumer items. Global trade was struggling, but people remained overwhelmingly optimistic, continuing to pour money into the stock market. Stock market returns were still hitting record highs. Extreme greed and unrealistic expectations filled the air, with investors buying stocks on margins as low as 10 to 40% of the actual price. They hoped to repay their loans when the stock sold for a large profit. By 1929, 40% of consumer debt was being used to purchase stocks. In the same year, Herbert Hoover was elected president, and he was optimistic about the country's future, stating, "We are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land, but things were about to take a dark turn." Catastrophe struck on October 24th, 1929, a day that became known as Black Thursday. The stock market saw heavy liquidation, with a record 12.9 million shares being sold. The market dropped 11%, marking the beginning of the Great Depression. The following week, on Black Tuesday, the market fell another 12%, with 16 million shares sold. In the span of just 2 weeks, stocks lost about a third of their value. People who had borrowed money to invest were crushed, and many lost their life savings. However, the stock market crash was not the sole cause of the Great Depression. While it triggered a recession, the real cause was that many banks had extended too many bad loans and had speculated too much. At the time, many US banks were small, independent institutions that had lent out a large portion of their assets to stock market speculations. When the stock market crashed, these banks went out of business overnight. There was no deposit insurance at the time, so when a local bank closed, people lost their money. As news of bank closures spread, panic ensued and people began pulling their savings from even healthy banks. This led to further bankruptcies, including the Bank of the United States in New York. A rumor spread that the bank had refused to sell a man stock, which caused 25,000 people to crowd the bank and withdraw $3 million by the end of the day. In response, the Bank of the United States closed its doors and asked the state to take over its assets. Ultimately, the bank failed to secure a short-term loan and closed down. It accounted for 1/3 of the $550 million lost in the Depression. This sent shockwaves throughout the banking industry, and many other banks started calling in loans and liquidating assets to stay afloat. By the end of the Depression, 1/3 of all US banks had failed, with people withdrawing their money and hoarding it outside of banks. The money supply in the US declined by 31% from 1929 to 1933. Deflation set in, which had devastating effects on the economy. Deflation increases the value of money, but discourages spending, investment, and worsens lessens the burden for those in debt. Wages and income fell, and the Federal Reserve failed to intervene, allowing the contraction of the money supply and the collapse of banks to worsen the situation. Herbert Hoover, who was president during the early years of the Depression, did not know how to effectively address the crisis and would be blamed for prolonging the economic downturn. In 1930, Hoover passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, aimed at protecting American farmers and industries from foreign competition. This raised tariffs on foreign imports by about 20%, and 25 countries retaliated by imposing their own tariffs on American goods. This resulted in a 66% decline in global trade from 1929 to 1934, further worsening the Depression. The Great Depression lasted over a decade, becoming the longest and most severe economic downturn in modern history. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped by 90% from its peak in 1929, and unemployment in the US reached 24.9%, the highest in history. To make matters worse, a severe drought and high winds led to the Dust Bowl, one of the worst man-made ecological disasters in American history. This devastation hurt farmers, many of whom had already been struggling, and led to even more widespread poverty. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, and he promised drastic action to lift the country out of the Depression. Roosevelt's New Deal programs helped stabilize the banking industry, provided aid to the needy, established a minimum wage, overtime pay, and created Social Security. Major banking reforms were also enacted, including federal deposit insurance for bank accounts, which helped prevent future bankruptcies. Roosevelt's New Deal programs helped restore public confidence, but it would take several more years for the U.S. economy to fully recover. The rise of extremist governments in other countries, largely driven by the economic hardships of the Depression, eventually led to World War II in 1939. The war marked the true end of the Great Depression, as the U.S. economy surged to support the war effort. Unemployment dropped below 10%, and the country saw a massive economic boom. Many lessons from the Great Depression continue to shape modern economic policies. These include the importance of a stable level of inflation to encourage consumer spending and investment, the role of government spending to stimulate the economy during a recession, and the need for government assistance during times of economic crisis. The Great Depression ultimately demonstrated that unchecked greed, speculative bubbles, and a failure to regulate the financial system can lead to disastrous consequences. By learning from the past, we can better understand the risks in our current economic system and be prepared to prevent similar crises in the future.